The night air was thick and suffocating, clinging to her skin like a wet shroud. Rain fell in sporadic sheets, cold and stinging, soaking through the tattered uniform she had been forced to wear since her capture. She pressed herself against the cracked stone wall of the abandoned outpost, listening intently. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a distant wooden door, every soft footstep on the wet ground could mean the difference between life and death. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the darkness, catching the faint glint of metal as a soldier's flashlight swept across the perimeter. They were arrogant, overconfident, unaware that their prisoner had not been broken, had not given up. They thought she was defeated, weak, someone who could be discarded like a broken tool. But tonight, everything had changed. Tonight, she was no longer the hunted, she was the hunter. She shifted her weight slightly, careful not to make a sound, and studied her surroundings. The camp was poorly defended, relying on numbers and intimidation rather than skill or strategy. The enemy guards followed predictable patterns, marching in monotonous loops around the perimeter, heads down, weapons lazily slung over their shoulders. She had observed them for days, memorizing their routines, noting the subtle ways they signaled to each other, learning their habits like a predator learning the movements of its prey. Every detail mattered. The squeak of a boot on a rotten plank, the shadow cast by the moon on a particular stone, the way the wind carried sound through the broken walls of the outpost. She had no weapons except what she had scavenged, a jagged shard of metal from the cell she had been held in, a thin wire she had twisted into a makeshift garrote, and her own two hands, honed by years of training, capable of lethal precision. The first guard approached the corner closest to her hiding spot. His steps were heavy, confident, assuming dominance in territory that was no longer his. She waited, her muscles coiled like springs, every nerve alert. The moment he stepped directly beneath the shadowed archway, she struck. Her movement was a blur, silent, unstoppable. The shard of metal met its mark, and the man collapsed instantly, a muted thud absorbed by the rain-soaked earth. She didn't pause to check, didn't hesitate to consider mercy, she simply melted back into the shadows. Another patrol passed moments later, oblivious to the fallen comrade behind them, talking and laughing, unaware that one of their own had already been silenced. The tension in her chest did not ease. Every strike, every decision carried weight. She knew that one wrong move would end her life instantly. She had been trained for combat, for survival, for extraction, but she had never been placed in a situation like this, a prisoner turned avenger, forced to dismantle an enemy from within. Yet she adapted quickly, thinking with cold, calculating logic. She moved from shadow to shadow, from ruin to ruin, leaving no trace, no scent, no evidence. Each step was a silent testament to her willpower and skill. She was a ghost in enemy territory, an invisible force that struck without warning. As the night wore on, the adrenaline surged, sharpening her senses. She could hear the faintest whisper of movement, the distant hum of generators, the subtle rustle of uniforms brushing against wet foliage. She visualized every soldier, predicting their paths, anticipating their reactions. One by one, she set them up for the inevitable. A guard leaning over to check the perimeter, a soldier turning a corner with complacent confidence, a pair talking too loudly by the entrance. Each one fell in silence, each one removed from the equation, leaving behind confusion and fear that she could feel. Like a tangible thing pressing in on her from the darkness. Time blurred, minutes became hours, and yet she remained focused, determined, and utterly relentless. Her mind was a steel trap, cataloging each movement, analyzing each opportunity. She was not just surviving, she was orchestrating a symphony of precision, turning the enemy's own overconfidence against them. The night seemed endless, a battleground of shadows and whispers, but she thrived within it. The fear that gripped her captors only fueled her, sharpening her resolve. By the time dawn's first light threatened the horizon, she had already eliminated the first wave of threats, and a small, terrifying seed of legend had begun to form among the surviving enemy soldiers. She was no longer just a captive. She was an unstoppable force, a shadow that could not be caught, a ghost that would not leave a trace, except for the bodies lying silently in the rain-soaked mud. By the second night, the enemy was starting to realize that something was terribly wrong. The initial confidence of patrols had evaporated, replaced by tension and suspicion. Guards no longer laughed or walked carelessly, they whispered to one another, eyes darting nervously into the shadows. Their overconfidence had been shattered by the sudden disappearances of comrades, the unexplained sounds in the dark, the faint glimmers of movement that vanished as quickly as they appeared. She watched from her concealed position atop the crumbling wall, a silent observer and predator. Each misstep of the enemy was an invitation, each sign of panic a doorway to opportunity. She had studied them, memorized their behavior, and now the advantage was hers. The camp was no longer a safe fortress, it had become a labyrinth of fear and mistakes. Soldiers doubled back on themselves, calling out in hushed tones for missing comrades, straining their ears to catch sounds that might betray her location. She knew their minds were fragile under pressure. She could exploit hesitation, confusion, and dread. One miscalculated step could separate a soldier from the group, leaving him vulnerable. She didn't need brute force alone, she needed cunning, patience, and perfect timing. She spotted her first target for the night, a sentry posted near a supply depot. His posture was rigid, chest puffed out, a facade of courage that she knew was brittle. She crept through the shadows, moving silently over wet stone and broken wood, every sense attuned to the rhythm of his breathing, the faint shiver of his body in the cold. When she was close enough, she struck with a swift, calculated motion. Her garrote snapped around his neck before he could cry out. He fell silently, a puppet cut from its strings. No alarm sounded. No one saw him go down. She melted into the darkness before the next patrol could pass, her movements fluid, deliberate, lethal. Hours passed, and she continued her methodical assault. A pair of soldiers walking too close together became a trap in her hands. She manipulated the environment, overturned crates, broken branches, puddles of water, to slow them down, to confuse them. When they stumbled, she was there, striking with the efficiency of a predator that had been waiting for this moment its entire life. Each elimination was a mixture of strategy and skill, precision and patience. She was no longer reacting. She was orchestrating, anticipating, and dictating the pace of the chaos. The enemy's morale deteriorated rapidly. Rumors spread among the remaining soldiers, shadows that moved without bodies, whispers in the wind, comrades vanishing without a sound. Fear became tangible, a thick fog that clouded their judgment. They began to suspect one another, pointing fingers, accusing, panicking. The camp was on the brink of collapse, not from overwhelming force, but from terror, exactly what she intended. She thrived in this psychological warfare, understanding that the mind could be just as deadly a weapon as any blade or gun. By the pre-dawn hours, only a handful of soldiers remained coherent, their nerves frayed, every sound amplified into a potential threat. She lured one into an alleyway, making him think he had a chance to regroup or escape. As he stepped into her trap, she emerged like a shadow materialized from the walls. There was no time for pleading, no time for hesitation. The strike was clean and decisive. Another life removed, another piece of the enemy's fortress falling silently. She paused for only a brief moment to observe the aftermath, crouched in the darkness as the last flickers of lantern light danced against the stone walls. The once proud camp was now riddled with fear, disarray, and silence. She allowed herself a fleeting sense of satisfaction, not for the violence itself, but for the mastery, for the realization that she had turned captivity into advantage, weakness into strength. She was no longer a victim, she was the storm, unpredictable and unstoppable. And yet, even as she moved to the next position, her focus never wavered. The night was far from over, and the enemy still had enough soldiers to be dangerous if underestimated. Every shadow could conceal a threat, every noise a trap. She remained vigilant, calculating, and patient, understanding that survival required not only skill but an unbroken mind. She would continue to eliminate them, one by one, until the camp was nothing but echoes and empty forms, the perfect reminder of what happens when the hunted becomes the hunter. By the third night, the enemy had been reduced to a handful of desperate, wary soldiers. Their once imposing camp had turned into a shadow of its former self, barricades overturned, equipment scattered, the faint smell of smoke and fear lingering in the air. They had begun to understand that the threat they faced was no ordinary soldier. The whispers of a ghostly assassin had spread through their ranks, and panic had taken root. Each remaining enemy was tense, calculating, but fear had already clouded their judgment. She watched from the shadows, her body low and her mind razor sharp. This was the final act, the culmination of days of meticulous planning, observation, and precise elimination. Tonight, there would be no mercy, no mistakes. She moved like a wraith, every step silent on the wet ground, every movement deliberate. The darkness was her ally, hiding her presence as she navigated through the ruined corridors and makeshift tents. One soldier, thinking he had found a hiding spot, crouched behind an abandoned supply crate. She struck without hesitation, a swift and silent takedown that left him motionless on the ground. No scream, no struggle, only silence. She continued through the camp, setting small traps, using every element of the environment to her advantage. Loose wires, slick puddles, and broken debris became weapons in her hands, turning the enemy's own space into a death trap. The remaining soldiers began to realize that they were being hunted. Shouts rang out in the darkness, but they were filled more with confusion than command. Each sound they made was anticipated, each movement predicted. She had learned their weaknesses, their patterns, and their fears, and she exploited them with ruthless precision. A soldier running toward the main gate stumbled on a hidden tripwire, crashing into a stack of crates. Before he could recover, she was upon him, her movements a blur, her hands striking with deadly accuracy. Another fell to a makeshift snare she had rigged, his struggles brief and futile. The chaos was orchestrated, a symphony of terror that she conducted alone. As dawn approached, the camp was nearly silent, save for the occasional rustle of movement from the last remaining guards. They were cornered, desperate, and exhausted. She knew the final confrontation was near, the last wave of resistance that stood between her and freedom. She positioned herself at the center of the camp, in a spot where every escape route for them would funnel into her calculated line of attack. When the first soldier entered, his eyes wide with panic, she struck with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. One by one, they fell. Her strikes were decisive, her movements fluid, almost artistic in their lethal efficiency. There was no hesitation, no room for error. Each life she ended was a step closer to complete liberation. Finally, only one soldier remained, the camp commander, a figure of authority whose arrogance had survived longer than the rest. He lunged at her, desperate and irrational, but she anticipated every move, sidestepping and countering with flawless timing. The fight was swift and brutal, a clash of survival instincts and trained skill. With a final, precise strike, she ended the confrontation. The camp was silent. The enemy had been eliminated, their morale shattered, and the fortress that had once held her captive was now nothing more than a hollow, abandoned shell. She paused to catch her breath, surveying the destruction she had wrought. Bodies lay still, traps dismantled, and the first rays of dawn began to pierce the fog. She allowed herself a moment to absorb the reality. She had survived, she had overcome, and she had turned what should have been her end into a complete victory. No one had expected the prisoner to become the predator, and now the legend of her skill and determination would linger in whispers, long after she had disappeared. With careful, measured steps, she disappeared into the wilderness beyond the camp, melting into the morning mist. Her mission was complete, her enemies defeated, and her freedom reclaimed. The enemy had underestimated her, had assumed weakness where there was only strength, and that mistake had cost them everything. She walked away with the confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds and emerged unbroken. Her story would be told in hushed tones, a testament to resilience, skill, and the power of the human will. If you've enjoyed this intense journey of survival and cunning, make sure to subscribe for more thrilling stories like this. You won't want to miss what comes next.